As we've gone through the third chapter of the Mishnah of Megillah, we've noticed that the Mishnah flick backwards and forwards, reading the Megillah itself, to questions about running a shul more generally, and particularly questions of Torah reading. And as we go into the fourth chapter, we're going to find exactly the same pattern. So the fourth chapter begins, HaKoret HaMegillah Omed v'Yoshev. The person that reads the Megillah can either stand or sit. And then goes on to explain, Kara Echad, Karahu Shnaim, Yatzau. Whether one person read it or whether two people read it, feels as if in the time of the Mishnah, you could have two people sort of reading out together. And it's okay, everyone's fulfilled their obligations. In places where it's the custom to say a blessing, the Gemara explains here, we're talking about the blessing after the Megillah reading, not before. The blessings before, there are three blessings before. There's the mitzvah over the Megillah reading, there's Al Hanisim, and there's Shechianu. And these are obligatory. Nobody argues with these, but the blessing after it, Haravet Rivenu, which we say, by the way, in every diaspora community now, was a matter of custom. So the Mishnah concludes, Veshelo levarech, lo yivarech, where it's not the custom to say it, they don't say the blessing. And with these brief remarks on Megillah reading, the Mishnah then turns to Torah reading. On Mondays and Thursdays and on Shabbat at Mincha, 3 read. So we are just visiting the Megillah reading. We're going to get back to Torah reading. And it's very interesting that with regard to the very first comment of the Mishnah on the Megillah, remember the Mishnah begins by saying, HaKoret HaMegillah Omed v'Yoshev. Someone who reads the Megillah can either stand or sit. And the Gemara immediately comes back. The first comment that the Gemara makes is, Ma she'ein kain ba Torah. That's not the case with regard to reading the Torah. As if the Gemara already has in mind the fact that we're using the Megillah reading as a kind of a hook here, but we're really focused on Torah reading. So we're teaching that on Mondays and Thursdays and on Shabbat at Mincha 3 read, Ein pochtin ve'ein mosifin alehem. No fewer. Interesting that Torah reading somehow is a public endeavor. We can't have fewer than 3 readers. In fact, our tradition today, where there's a Baal Koreh, there's a kind of a community reader who reads for everybody, is very odd. The Mishnah does not know about a community reader. For the Mishnah, 3 individuals from the Kehillah come up and 3 people read. And that is a minimum. Ein pochatin. You can't have fewer than that. But people have to go to work. So, ein mosifin alehen. We can't add to those either. Ve'ein maftirim banavi. We don't have a haftarah from the prophets. For the same reason, people need to get to work. Hapoteach ve'achotem b'torah. The person that begins the Torah reading, it's the first of the 3. Ve'achotem b'Torah, the last of the 3, the ones who begin and the ones who conclude it, make a blessing before it and after it. So again, it seems as if in the time of the Torah reading that we only said 2 blessings. We said one at the beginning and one at the end. And again, some of us find this very unusual today, because today, every Torah reader makes a blessing when he begins and when he finishes. So on Shabbat, say, where we call up 7, we're going to make these blessings 7 times. But it seems that in the time of the Mishnah, they only made the blessings once at the beginning of the first reading and once at the end of the 7th reading. And the Gemara actually explains in a way that's, again, very familiar to us, who, if anyone's been involved with a synagogue, the Gemara gives an explanation which is very, very familiar. The Gemara says, well, okay, you might just require one blessing at the beginning and one at the end. But what if someone walked in late? Or what if someone left early? If someone came in late, they might miss the blessing. And they might think that it's possible to read from the Torah without a blessing. And that somehow is quite appalling in the minds of the rabbis. For the rabbis, this is not a ritual. This is a holy act. We cannot read from the Torah without a blessing. And someone who comes in late shouldn't think that it's possible to read from the Torah without a blessing. And along the same line, someone who leaves early shouldn't think that it's possible to read from the Torah without a blessing.
To tell you something.
So
remember, I was telling you about.
They will. We make a blessing at the beginning, at the end of every single Torah reading. What about moving beyond Mondays and Thursdays? On Rosh Chodesh and on the intermediate days of festivals, 4 people read. A little bit more holy. We go up in holiness. We don't drop back. But people still have to go to work. We don't have fewer and we don't have more. And we don't conclude with a haftarah from the prophets. And the Mishnah seems to emphasize again the first reader and the last reader blesses before and after. And of course, today we add these extra blessings. It doesn't seem to occur to the rabbis that some would actually walk out in the middle of the Torah reading. Maybe that's an unthinkable thing to do. Zehakla, this is the principle. Kol sheyesh bo musaf eino yom tov korin arba'a. This is the general rule. Any day which has a musaf and is not a festival, so that's really intermediate days of Sukkot, for example, and Rosh Chodesh. On any day with musaf and is not a festival, is not a Yom Tov, Korin Arba'a, we 4 read. And then gradually we go up. B'Yom Tov Chamisha, B'Yom HaKippurim Shisha, B'Shabbat Shiva. On a festival 5, on Yom Kippur 6, on Shabbat 7. So we can see this is still a communal obligation, and it encompasses more and more of the community as the day becomes holier. And on these holidays, Ein Pochtin Mehem, we don't have fewer than those. It's still a community obligation. Aval Mosifin Alehem, but we can add to them. Umaftirim Banavi, and we have a maftir, we have a haftarah from the prophets. And again, this idea that we say brachot before and after the Torah reading must be incredibly important to the rabbis because they articulate it 3 times in this chapter of Mishnah. And by the way, on Shabbat, we're going to multiply the minimum number of blessings by 7. And we're generally very careful not to utter a blessing that is not required. So it is interesting that the rabbis will multiply by 7 the number of blessings that are minimally required, just in order to take care of people who arrive late or who leave early. It's a very interesting comment, first of all, on the reality of life in the synagogue in the time of the Talmud, but also on how seriously the rabbis took the idea that when we read from Torah, we say a bracha. What about other public acts? Ein porsin et shema. We don't pores the Shema. This seems to be something to do with reciting the blessings publicly before it and after it. Or maybe it's the blessing of Baruch Hu. We're not quite clear what this is. We don't pores the Shema. But we'll get the idea as we read these other examples. Ve'ein ovrin lifnei hatava. And we don't go before the ark. That means that we don't have the prayer leader repeat the Amidah. Ve'ein nosin et kapehem, and they don't lift up their hands. This is the priests blessing the people. Ve'ein korin b'Torah, and we don't read from the Torah. This is our Mishnah, of course. Ve'ein maftirim b'Navi, we don't have a haftarah from the prophets. Ve'ein osim ma'amadu moshav, we don't make ma'amadu moshav is standing up and sitting down. We don't make these stops on the funeral procession to make a hesped for the dead person. Ve'ein omrim birkat avelim, we don't say the blessing for mourners. Ve'tanchumei avelim, and the comforts for the mourners. Uvirkat chatanim, and the blessing of bridegrooms. These are the Sheva brachot. Ve'ein, I think they are the 7 brachot. Ve'ein muzamnim b'shem, we don't introduce birkat hamazon with God's name. Nevarech Elokeinu shiachal mishalo. Pachot me'asara, with fewer than 10. We need 10 to do these things. And uvakarkaot tisha v'kohen. And if we're redeeming land, we can deal with 9 and a kohen. This is redeeming land from a kohen. So the kohen is effectively the kohen is a actor in the transaction. But it seems like he can also be part of the minyan, because it's 9 and a kohen. In other words, you need the kohen who's acting in the transaction for redeeming land can be one of the 10. And similarly, if you're redeeming a human. And the Ramban mentions here, this is in his commentary, Selfa Milchamot Hashem. There's a commentary on the Rif, actually. So it's a slightly obscure, but it's an important, it's quite an important point. He says, everything that's mentioned in this Mishnah, Kulam chovat hatzibur hen. These are all obligations that devolve on the public. They're public obligations. They only apply to people who are obligated. In other words, a private person, let's say you're ill in hospital, and you don't have a minyan. You don't have an obligation to get your friends to create a minyan so that you can hear the Torah reading. The community has an obligation to provide a Torah reading. So if there's a community, they need to put on a Torah reading in shul. There's a communal obligation to do that. But there isn't a private obligation. Same with Birkat Hamazon. You're not obligated to find 9 people to bench with you. If you have them, that's great, but you're not obligated to find 9 people to bench with you if you're alone. And that's different from the Megillah. The Ramban continues, Aval ba Megillah, kashem she'ad tzibur chayav, kach kol yachid ve'yachid chayav. The Megillah is obligatory for every single individual, as well as for the community. The community needs to put on a Megillah reading, but every single individual is obligated. And that's very different. So if you're in hospital, you need to, you need to find some. That's why people walk around hospitals with a Megillah, because each and every person is obligated. Now, what is there about 10? What is there about 10? And the Rambam says in his commentary on the Mishnah, Amar Hashem, that God said, that is to say, we read in the Torah, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. It's a quote from the beginning of the parsha of Emor. Actually, we read this quotation on the first day of Sukkot and the second day of Sukkot too in diaspora. V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. I will be sanctified in the midst of the people of Israel. Uva ha'kabbalah kol davar shebiktusha lo yeh pachot me'asara. It comes through the tradition that any matter related to holiness shouldn't occur with fewer than 10. Somehow, b'toch b'nei Yisrael means 10 people. The Gemara actually learns this uses the word b'toch to learn in a rather convoluted way from the 10 spies who gave bad reports about the people of Israel, and from the congregation of Korach, who rebelled against Moshe. Very interesting. The Gemara should derive the 10 men, the minyan, or the 10 people, actually. The Mishnah does not say men, and the Rambam does not say men. The idea that a minyan is male, it comes much later in the tradition. The Mishnah just says 10. But it derives them from the least likely individuals you might think of, from the congregation of Korach, who rebelled, and from the 10 spies who gave bad reports about the people of Israel, as if to say, we need 10, but these 10 don't have to be tzaddikim. They don't have to be saints. Any 10 people from the Jewish community can create a community. Even the most unlikely characters, when they come together, they create a holy community in which God says, "V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael." I will be sanctified among the people of Israel, whoever they are.